Today I'm looking at the greatest wristwatches of all time, and I can guarantee that this is not the list you expect. History didn't happen the way they want you to think it did. Water resistance in a wristwatch today is pretty much expected, but back in the early 1900s, it was still a problem that needed solving. Men had started wearing wristlets through World War I, starting first with small pocket watches mounted in a wrist-worn holder, evolving into soldered lugs with a strap to hold it in place. But these weren't waterproof, and so they broke easily. A solution already existed, as had been exhibited in a pocket watch displayed in a fish tank at the Great Exhibition in London 1851. A screw-down case, crown and bezel, sealing out dust and water. That was the technology used by Tavannes Watch Co. for a water-resistant wristwatch commissioned by two British submarine commanders, as documented in the Horological Journal in 1917. It's believed the watch had been in use since 1915, however, also featuring anti-magnetic properties to cope with a submarine's unshielded electronics. The name of that watch? The Submarine. Our next greatest watch of all time is another first, this time one of a more daily convenience. For as long as pocket watches existed, they were manually wound, and despite Abraham Louis Perellet inventing a self-winding pocket watch in 1776, they pretty much stayed that way. Winding a wristwatch is a lot trickier, however, and so that pocket watch tech was revived in 1922 to be found in the first automatic wristwatch made by John Harwood. His system featured a spinning rotor that bounced like a hammer back and forth against a fixed block, with two sprung cushions to soften the blow. The patent was in by 1924 and the watch released in 1926 as the first automatic wristwatch ever made. It solved another problem too, the ingress of dust and moisture when a crown was unscrewed to wind a watch. Now the case could remain sealed, powered by the kinetic energy of the wrist. It could stay wound forever without manual winding, and as such, Harwood called the watch Perpetual. In case you're wondering, Rolex acknowledged Harwood's achievements in the following statement, published in the Sunday Express. Harwood was the inventor of the first self-winding wristwatch, and we apologize for any injury to his feelings. In 1928, the watchmaker Girard-Perregaux was purchased by a company called Mimo, short for Manufacture Internationale de Montre Or, and Mimo had grand aspirations to make Girard-Perregaux a frontrunner in the newfangled wristwatch craze. World War I had crippled Girard-Perregaux financially, and so it was to innovation the business turned to save itself. There was the Mimo-Rex, a reversible watch with two dials, the Mimo-Olympic, a monopusher chronograph released for the 1936 Olympics, and the 1930 Mimo-Meter, the world's first wristwatch with a date. There were a couple of versions of this watch, one with a big date at 12 and another with the now classic smaller date at 3. The idea was that the date could be easily readable from under a cuff, poking out just enough to be seen. The first recorded attempt to summit Mount Everest's 8,849-meter peak occurred in 1921, with a 1924 expedition claiming the lives of British climbers George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. The deadly climb to the peak was once again attempted in 1953 by a team led by Edmund Hillary and Nepalese Sherpa Tenzing Norgay, who were successful. On their wrists, surviving the extreme environment, were the Smith's A409 watches, the first to summit Everest. You might be wondering, wasn't it a Rolex that summited Everest? The adverts that came out immediately upon the news of the expedition's success certainly promoted that idea. As it happens, there's no documented proof of that, and all imagery of the pair on their climb to the peak shows them wearing Smith's watches. In fact, upon questioning, Rolex published the following statement in the British Horological Institute Journal. It would appear that Sir Edmund Hillary was, in fact, only wearing one watch at the summit, and that was a Smith's watch. We congratulate Smiths on the fact that their wristwatch reached the summit with Sir Edmund Hillary. Whilst the water-resistant wristwatch had been in existence for a few decades, a dedicated dive watch was still unheard of. It wasn't until the 1940s invention of the aqualung scuba system by Émile Gagnan and Jacques Cousteau that underwater exploration really became possible. Of course, it was Navy special forces around the world that quickly adopted this new technology, and they needed a suitable watch to accompany them. Timing was critical to life, and so a dive watch not only needed to be waterproof, but easy to read in difficult conditions and capable of timing fixed periods in a mechanically simple way. In partnership with the French Navy, and tested by Jacques Cousteau, Blancpain started work on the 50 Fathoms in 1952, the world's first dedicated dive watch, which adopted a turning bezel as its solution to the timing problem. Simple and very reliable, it has become a staple of the genre. In fact, it was the 50 Fathoms dots and dashes dial variant, with a triangle at 12, that would become the US Navy's blueprint for all mil-spec watches. Oh hello, I didn't see you there. I was too busy enjoying all this fantastic new channel merch, and you can too. So if you want to be as cool as me, or perhaps even cooler, check it out just below the video. Thanks very much. So Rolex may not have made the first waterproof watch or the first dedicated dive watch, but it was insistent on hitting a milestone with its dive watches, and so from 1953, a record-breaking deep-sea special watch was conceived right alongside the Submariner. The first of these watches, prototype number 1, accompanied Jacques Piccard and his father Auguste in the submersible Trieste, 3,150 meters below the surface, comfortably surviving those previously unexplored depths. But it was the third prototype that accompanied Jacques in 1960 to the deepest part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench, at 10,908 meters deep. It was fitted with a thicker crystal, some 33 times thicker than a typical crystal, to survive the crushing 6-ton per square inch pressures. It was the first watch to go that deep, and to this day, there have only been 2 more to do it. The first watch worn in space is a bit of a twofer because it depends specifically who you're talking about wearing it. Of course, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, wore a Russian Shturmanskie on board Vostok 1 for his 108-minute mission in April of 1961. A Shturmanskie, the chronograph Strela, was also worn for the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov in 1965, who spent 12 minutes outside the spacecraft. His spacesuit ballooned and he was forced to let some of the air out in order to get back in again. But the record of the first watch worn in space doesn't belong to either of those men. On board Sputnik 4 was a living crew member, but not a human. It was Chanushka, the space dog, and Chanushka was wearing a Pobeda. The story, as recounted by the watch's owner, Dr. Abraham Genin, a Soviet aerospace medical researcher, goes as follows. Genin had received the watch during his time in the military and, bored of it, decided to see how it would fare in space. He'd worn it every day since he'd received it, and it had survived plenty of abuse, and so he strapped it to one of the dog's legs to see what would happen. To his surprise, the mission, the dog, and the watch all survived, and when the unauthorized watch was traced back to him, he got in trouble. Successfully landing humans on the moon and safely returning them to Earth is perhaps the greatest human achievement of all time. It's a triumph that, even to this day, remains nigh on impossible, that came closest to a vision of humanity over the next 100 or even 1,000 years. It's hardly a secret that the watch that accompanied the legendary people who undertook these missions is an Omega Speedmaster. Despite being entirely off the shelf for NASA's purposes, it's like the watch had already been designed for the role from the start. From its 1957 launch to the official 1965 adoption by NASA, the Speedmaster has evolved from a groundbreaking formula to provide clear, accurate timekeeping. Chronographs prior to the Speedmaster were small, illegible, and delicate. The big Speedmaster with the tachymeter scale on the outside and a bold black dial with contrasting white markers defined sports chronographs, even to today. There really only ever was one choice for the first watch worn on the moon. The 60s and 70s were a tumultuous time for the Swiss watch industry, a period of technological change that threatened to destroy an entire skill set. The future was electricity, and it was progressing fast. Electric clocks were actually first experimented with in the 1800s, but things really started getting serious when Patek Philippe unveiled its first in 1952. By 1956, Patek Philippe had shrunk the enormous device down to just 2 by 4 feet, and by 1958 it had been miniaturized further. It was clear that the race was on to harness the technology in a wearable form. The Swiss government actually established a working group for this problem, seeing how so much of its export relied on mechanical watchmaking, the outcome being the Beta 21 quartz movement, developed by a consort of watchmakers. But despite clocking in record performance at the observatory trials, it was the Japanese brand Seiko that was able to bring a commercially available quartz watch to market first, the Astron. The price of the Seiko Astron in 1969 was high, costing as much as a car, but that price soon fell, and so too did the Swiss watch industry, dropping from 1,600 businesses to just 600 in a few years. The Astron was a definitive line in the sand for the future of watchmaking. The recovery of the Swiss watch industry following the quartz crisis is often attributed to the iconic and divisive Royal Oak, which repurposed mechanical watchmaking as a stylish luxury pursuit. But whilst that watch loudly proclaimed the future to be dominated by very recognisable and very expensive silhouettes, the quiet reclamation of the industry can actually be attributed to another Audemars Piguet, the reference 5548. As has been demonstrated by this second-generation demand for the Royal Oak and other watches like it, the luxury watch market is dictated at its origin by the collectors and the niche corners they pursue at auction. For them, Audemars Piguet was a manufacturer of greatly complex pieces, and not so much the Royal Oak, and so the manufacturer needed to demonstrate its relevance to them as much as its desirability to the nouveau riche. The Perpetual calendar has always been a bastion of high-end watchmaking for its complexity and innovation, and facing the early electronic computers of the age, it stood a chance at holding its own. And so Audemars Piguet fashioned an automatic Perpetual calendar wristwatch, just 36mm across and 7mm thick, to prove that mechanical watchmaking could be as svelte and as smart as quartz, and yet didn't need a battery. The project was completed in 1978 and was commissioned in an initial batch of 159 watches, as many Perpetual calendars as Audemars Piguet had made in the last half-century. It was not only a commitment to Audemars Piguet's foundation as a watchmaker of complications, but also outstripped the performance of its nearest rival, the 1961 Patek Philippe 3448, by a full 4mm in thickness. Those are my top 10 greatest wristwatches of all time. What would you change on that list? Let me know in the comments below. Please also like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Still here? Watch this video next.